Before the Second World War, Poland was located between Germany from the west and Soviet Union from the east. On 1st September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 16 days later, on 17th September 1939, Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Russia's invasion of eastern Poland brought repressions, mass killing, and deportations over 500,000 people to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Ms. Teresa Kusiak presents the story of her grandmother, Elżbieta Soboń, documented in family albums and official publications.
Hi, I'm Teresa Kusiak. I'm the first generation Polish Canadian of parents from Poland, and it's a very complicated history of how they came to Canada, but I'll talk a little bit about my mother's side of the family. My mother's name was Helena Soboń. She was 4.5 years old the day the Russians came. She was living at the farmhouse with her mother, Elżbieta Soboń, her little brother, Mieczik, her father, Józef Soboń, and her father's mother, so her grandmother. My mother and her mother and her grandmother all ended up having to leave Poland on February 10th, 1940. My mother told me a lot of the stories, and I wrote down in her words some of that story that I'm going to read to you now. On February 10th, 1940, on a brutally cold winter's night, Russian soldiers with bayonets fixed to their rifles entered our farmhouse in Elonorówka in eastern Poland, now Ukraine. I'm not sure if I remember or I can imagine from the stories that were retold. Tata was pushed into the corner against the wall with a soldier pointing a rifle at him. Another soldier was following Mamusha while she hurried to pack some provisions because we were to be deported, a journey of unspecified length to an unknown destination. I was 4.5 years old, and my brother Mieczik was 2.5. And when the Russians came, they were given half an hour to just grab whatever possessions they could, whatever food they could, in order to survive whatever was ahead of them. They didn't know what that was going to be. So when they had packed up the provisions they could pack in that short amount of time, they were brought outside to sleighs that were waiting to bring them to the train station. And my mother remembered that as they're driving away on the horse on the sleigh to the train station, that they saw the horses that were on their farm, and my mother wondered what's going to happen to those horses. And she saw the laundry that was hanging frozen on the line, that was never going to be picked up again and brought into the house, and clothes they would never wear again, and the house they would never see again. And as they were riding to the train station, the family dog was running alongside the sleigh until he couldn't run anymore. And when they got to the train station, they joined lots and lots of other Polish people. All their farming neighbors were there, a different family was there, and then they were all shuttled into the cattle cars. And my mother remembers that the cattle cars had like a little window in them, and she would sit at the top bunk looking out this window on this long ride that apparently took weeks in brutally cold weather. And while they were driving, she remembers looking out the window and seeing when the train was going around a corner that there was just so many cars, and that's all she could see was white snow and all the different parts of the train going around. The train would stop once in a while to open the door and take out dead bodies as people were dying from the cold, from exhaustion, from fear, from starvation. And they would open the doors and people would come out and get some snow, and how they were able to change little kids' diapers is something I can't even fathom what they were able to do. But they had a little stove inside the cattle car, and that's where they would take turns making soup or cooking whatever they can cook. And so one time when the train stopped and everybody was out, my mother, who was on this train, and there was her mother, her father, her little brother, and her grandmother, they stopped and move their legs and get some fresh air, and the train started up again. And my grandmother and her grandfather and my mother's little brother were together on the train, but my mother was still out on the platform with her grandmother. And my mother remembers thinking, oh my God, if only I see my mother's face one more time, because she was afraid she'd never see it again. Even at that young age, she knew that death was everywhere and that it was possible to never see something again. So while she was out there running beside the train, a Jewish family who knew the family grabbed my mother and thought, okay, we're going to take care of her until we can hopefully join up. And they went on the train, and at the next stop, they got out, and sure enough, my grandmother had gotten out at that stop as well, hoping that, beyond hope, that her daughter would be there. And then there was a wonderful reunion as my mother got to see her mother again, and her father and her little brother. But sadly, nobody knew what happened to the grandmother. She was there at one time with my mother at the train station, but then gone. And that remained a mystery, even though my grandmother asked so many people if they saw her, if they knew her. Nobody knew. She just disappeared. Whether she fell onto the tracks, whether she just disappeared in the snow. Another mystery, another soul lost from our family. When they finally reached Siberia, some say it took 30 days to get there, so at least a month of traveling on these cramped cattle cars. There was a requirement. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And my grandmother ended up going straight to work as a lumberjack, working in the forest as everybody else did, felling trees from morning until night. And conditions were very bad. People were starving. The food allocations were very, very minor, very meager. And because of that, because of the lack of vitamins, even sometimes they would get night blindness or snow blindness walking back from the camp. My grandmother would help her sister by holding onto her arm so that she can make her way back to the camp. But they lasted in Siberia for 2 years somehow. Death was everywhere around them and sickness was everywhere. While there, they lost more members of the family. My grandmother's mother and father died within a few weeks between them. They died while they were in Siberia. But then amnesty was declared in 1942, which gave them a chance to get out of Siberia to sign up with the Polish army. So people started to make their way to Uzbekistan, where they were going to be enlisting to the army, where the men were enlisting to the army. So they made their way to Uzbekistan, where apparently the conditions were almost as bad as Siberia as far as hunger and disease. It was just everywhere. So conditions in Uzbekistan were very, very hard. It was a hard life, lots of sickness, lots of people dying. And 5 days before they left Uzbekistan to travel to Tehran, my mother's little brother, Miechik, passed away. He was in the hospital and he was very, very sick. And on February 2nd, he died. And on February 7th is when they left Uzbekistan to go to Tehran. They went there on huge ships with lots of people being sick on the ships from seasickness and traveling until they got to Tehran. And when they got there, my mother said it was quite a celebration. People were there with food for them, hard-boiled eggs, bringing them fruit. And actually, it was so wonderful to see people being so welcoming. The problem is none of these children or adults were used to eating, and a lot of them got sick because of having too much rich food when they got to Tehran. But my mother lived in Tehran from 1942 until 1946. And at that time in 1946 is when they moved on to Lebanon. The first time that she actually said that they had a house, like with real walls. It wasn't a tent or a mud hut anymore. It was an actual house, and they lived not too far from the Mediterranean Sea. And she remembers going there to see the ships coming in. But Lebanon went to school. She felt like she had a pretty normal life there for a child displaced person. And her and her mother persevered. Her mother worked. She worked as a nurse in a hospital. She worked wherever she could find work. In Lebanon, my mother and her family her family was her mother, I guess. My mother and my grandmother were in Lebanon in 1946. There they lived in a house by the sea in Beirut, just a few blocks from the sea, and my mother remembers watching the boats on the water. Went to school there. Apparently they were still sharing accommodations, and they would have just a blanket hanging down between the different families or different beds that were there. They lived in Lebanon for a couple of years. So in 1948, in February, they were in Egypt. From there, within a month, March of 1948, is when they went on the ship and had their first big ship travel to England. And they ended up staying at a camp, Marsworth, where Polish refugees were, displaced persons, at a camp in Marsworth. And while they were living there for the next 3 years, my mother spent most of her time in a boarding school in Diddington, and it was all Polish families there. And her mother worked at the Biada Manufacturing Company in Marsworth, and they lived in these shelters that looked like airplane hangars, and they were living on an airplane base, an air base. And so there'd be the long runways, and they would ride their bikes up and down the runways. And there was a little tuck shop. And it was the first time that it felt like life was becoming normal again for her. And so lived in England from 1948 until coming across the ocean on the Empress of France, and made it to Canada in 1952. When they came to Canada, they followed my grandfather, who was living in Timmins, Ontario. He was working as a civil engineer in a mine, one of the underground mines there. And so that's where my grandmother and my mother followed him, and had a little house on Cedar Street in Timmins. And my great uncle lived next door. He worked on the railway tracks. He would do labor building tracks, I believe, on the railroad, and he'd travel across Canada. And when my mother and father got married, we lived 1 block away up the street on Cedar Street, and we lived a very happy life, full of the customs and traditions from a Polish culture. Even though my mom left Poland when she was just 4.5, all through the years, regardless of the triumphs, the tragedies, the hardships that they had, they clung on to any of the traditions that they could, all the songs that they remembered from the Polish way of life. And that's what was given down to my brother and I, and just was a very wonderful, rich life that we lived. Life has been very good for our family. I now live in Ottawa. My grandparents have all passed away, but I have 3 wonderful children. I have 3 grandchildren, and I'm doing everything I can to pass on all those wonderful traditions to my family. My cooking is not as good as my mother's and grandmother's. Don't make the best gołąbki and pierogi, but I keep trying, and that's what I try to teach my children. Just live a good life, and we'll all be happy. I'd like to tell a story about this particular Polish outfit. A very old Polish outfit. So what happened when the families were on the trains to Siberia, from Poland to Siberia? The trains would stop, and sometimes people would get off, and the trains would go again, and people just didn't make the train, and they went missing. And one of those missing people would be my great-grandmother. So my mother's grandmother, who is with her, went missing. No idea what happened to her. But her mother still had her clothes and everything else that she had brought with her from Poland, including a coat. She had this long black coat that my grandmother kept. She kept it hoping that someday they would reunite and she could give the coat back to her mother-in-law. but that was not to be. We never did find out what happened to my grandmother. But as the travels went, my grandmother held on to that coat through Siberia, through Uzbekistan, and then when they got to Tehran, because people were living in terrible conditions and full of disease and lice, all the clothes were taken from them and burned to try to get rid of all this, and they were given clothes from the Red Cross. Somehow my grandmother was able to hold on to that coat that belonged to her mother-in-law. How she did that, there were many miracles that happened during the deportations to Siberia and life afterwards, but that is one miracle, how she held on to that coat. But what she ended up doing is, after they got to Tehran, she hired a woman to make this Polish vest for her daughter, for my mother. And my mother would wear it at different occasions and had this little vest made from her grandmother's coat, which would be my great-grandmother, my children's great-great-grandmother, and my grandchildren's great-great-great-grandmother. It's just amazing that we still have this in our family.
Krzyżem ze Słońców Sybiru odznaczona zostaje również pośmiertnie pani Elżbieta Ewa Soboń, and the cross is received by her granddaughter, Mrs. Teresa Kusiak.
Dziękuję bardzo.